I've mentioned before the idea that as a writer, one of the hardest things to do is to build up to a point. I mean, like, you always have that thing where it's like, God, I just really want to get to the good stuff. I really want to get to the payoff. I've got this great reveal or this great examination or this great character moment. I just want to get to that moment. It took Babylon 5 3 years of the show actually going on to get to this moment. JMS himself has actually said that he wrote this moment 10 years before it came out. Just to give you an idea of how long he's been building to this particular moment. So yeah, I'm just going to hit it right off the bat. Valen, Sinclair, same person. Interesting in hindsight, isn't it? I kind of hinted at this several times as we were going throughout the series, most especially in Season 1, where it came up many times. And they show you a couple of flashbacks from Season 1 towards the end to really help hammer that point in, just in case you forgot about them. That's a hell of a planning effort. And for the amount of effort and time put into writing this, I'm going to go ahead and give JMS some credit and not point out the flaws. There are some actual inconsistencies between Babylon Squared and War Without End. They've been documented. Just about everyone knows about them. I'm not going to get into them. I think he did a pretty good job as is, and I think that should be rewarded with me not nitpicking it too much. I do want to say I find the title interesting in its own right. His point, of course, I mean, see, this is funny. When I first heard about the title of War Without End, I assumed it meant the Circle, because we have a fairly basic time loop here, which I'll discuss in a bit. So I thought it was like the war between them and the Shadows, and then the previous war between them and the Shadows, and I thought that was like the War Without End. It turns out that's actually not what JMS meant at all. His intention was to explain that there is always war, that at some point or another we are always fighting. And in retrospect, that does fit in better with the themes of the episode, especially given the amount of time and effort that is spent on the future part with Londo and Sheridan. Early on, there is a wonderful shot of Minbar. It is absolutely gorgeous. It goes very well with the paradise sort of presentation that the Minbari themselves present. We are the enlightened people. We are above all these other concerns, all that fun stuff. I point that out because it's another one of those aspects of Minbari culture, which, granted, we've examined many, many times, and I don't need to go into extensive detail on. But if you think about it, it is very Minbari. We want everything to look beautiful and bright, lots of light. Everywhere there's these lights, and we want everything to have this sort of angelic feel to it. Very, for lack of a better term, Vorlon feel to it, actually. I wonder why. If you want another example of this kind of concept, well, just look at the Asari over on Mass Effect. I know I've been bringing up the Mass Effect thing a lot lately. For some strange reason, Andromeda, Mass Effect's been on my mind lately, so I do apologize. But, I mean, as has been said before, Mass Effect was inspired by Babylon 5. They've admitted that flat out, and, several parallels narratively could be drawn between the two. So, Sinclair is back. Woo! This is actually the last time we'll really be seeing Sinclair. Actually, I think this is the last time we see Sinclair, period. Not counting reusage of footage. So, this is kind of his actual send-off. And I have to admit, it's a hell of a send-off to be turned into frickin' Valen, the most holy of individuals in Minbari culture. I mean, for God's sakes. That reveal, by the way, does explain so many different things. Why was a Minbari soul found within a human soul? Given the fact that it was Sinclair himself that they scanned, remember? Why is it that the device they used to scan it looked a lot like a comm chip thing built out of, their Earth Force technology? Why is it that there's all these things about, a Minbar not born of Minbar, and, the other half of our species and all that fun stuff? All the pieces line up nicely. And I mention that because it's something JMS is very good at. He presents all of this to you, and it could be taken at face value. That's it, the end. There is no specifics or there's no soul involved. There's no spiritual or belief or faith or metaphysical aspect involved at all. It's just as is presented on the face of it. And you can take it that way, you can interpret it that way, and that's a totally valid way to interpret it. Or, if you choose to, you may also decide that souls are a real thing. I've actually talked about this before in Babylon 5. You may decide that within the setting of Babylon 5, there are such a thing as souls. There is an actual connection between them, and these prophecies weren't just predictions, but actual prophecies in addition to that, and that there's more of an element to it. And of course, the two merge quite nicely because they're not incongruent with each other. I like that. I like being allowed to make the decision for myself. JMS's writing also lends itself quite a bit towards banter. The question has actually been asked of him, and I've actually seen this in a previous episode too. There was a line in Babylon Squared where Garibaldi actually ad-libbed a single line, and it caused a big stir, because JMS is very hard line on the rules about ad-libbing lines. He wants what's in the script to be on the screen, because there's so much foreshadowing, there's so much significance, and there's so much relevance in his writing that ties in because of the nature of the string continuity aspect of the story. So he wants to make sure that people don't just suddenly decide to say something out of character or off the cuff. I mention that, though, because JMS actually went out of his way to basically get better at writing banter, specifically so that it would seem more natural and feel kind of like it was ad-libbed when it wasn't. Because that's the point. Usually when we say ad-libbed or improvised when it comes to acting, we mean it seems more natural. That's what we actually mean when we say that. And so the fact that he's able to write that says a lot for his abilities as a writer, at least when it comes to certain aspects of writing. I like how there's no attempt to make this a Sheridan versus Sinclair situation. I like how the two different command styles are presented, and the fact that the two do seem to think in similar ways in many different aspects. And that's not just because of the fact that originally they were the same character. But I do want to mention one thing. I hate to point this out. Over on Star Trek, it took us years to have Picard and Kirk finally meet each other. And it was in Generations. Now, if you like Generations, that's great. I actually enjoy rewatching Generations. But it's a crap film, in my opinion. Even despite my enjoyment of it, it is a crap film. And the final meeting of Kirk and Picard was lackluster at best. It is sad that in a TV show, the meeting of Sheridan and Sinclair has more weight and more scenes of significance between them than Star Trek did in a movie. But I talked about that over my Generations rumination. They had so many issues making that movie. It's kind of ridiculous. There's a line here. Just as Zathras said. Poor Zathras. There's no B-plot of this episode. Do you notice that, by the way? I only point that out. It's not really that unusual, but even on B5, they usually had a B-plot. It was usually in service to the A-plot, or in a way helped flesh out future arcs or established characterization, or was basically part of the overall narrative. But there's no B-plot at all in this episode. JMS himself said that there was just no room whatsoever. In fact, there were several scenes that had to be cut because there was no room whatsoever, that they couldn't explain everything away. It's also probably not helped by the fact that they had several scenes from Babylon Squared just copied and edited into the episode to help show the coherence of things. That's an interesting tactic, and something I actually like as a writer when it's done properly. Probably one of my favorite examples is actually from a webcomic called Bob and George. I know that's weird, but hear me out. There's a scene where now this is not a perfect example of this, but just bear with me. There's a comic where he's talking, and all of a sudden he starts saying stuff that doesn't quite make sense, but kind of adds in, it kind of slides in with regards to the overall narrative. Then we see, pretty much the next comic, it's the altered version to show both sides of the conversation. That's kind of what happened here. Babylon Squared was one half of the conversation. Now, and because of the fact that they added Babylon Squared into this episode, we are seeing both halves of the conversation. We now have a complete picture of what the hell was going on. And a lot of things make a lot more sense. I'll actually point out a couple of those as we go, but it also is amusing to me. One thing I've been wondering for a while is why was B4 larger and more military than B5, or B3, or B2, or B1? Why was B4 the big one? Well, we do have a bit of an in-character reasoning for that. I've discussed that before. But now we have the out-of-character reasoning for that. We needed this massive military station to help win the war against the fricking Shadows 1,000 years ago. And even though it's a human station helping the Minbari, 1,000 years is a long fricking time for technological development. I'm pretty sure that it's going to help significantly. And in fact is probably going to help jumpstart Minbari technology a little bit too. Which would also kind of help to explain how Minbari and human technology is so... works together. I can't think of the term all of a sudden. This is going to bother me. So, not adaptable. Ah, that's going to bother me. I can't think of the word. Anyways. There's a lot of... I mentioned in just the previous episode the idea of backstory and background characters and how difficult it is to write. I mentioned that with regards to Adira and Londo, right? Well, it's funny because that actually has immediate relevance here in this episode. Oh, by the way, if it's not obvious, I'm covering both two-parters as if they are one. Mostly because they are effectively one story, but also because, to be completely honest, I don't actually have that much to talk about in this otherwise amazing episode. I keep running into that problem. If I feel so guilty... I'm like, oh man, and I feel like I just nailed the rumination, and I hit the quit, I cut off the recording, and I checked the thing, and it's like 26 minutes, and I'm like, what? That's it? That's all I had to say? So we're smushing these ones together. They really are one episode anyways. So in order to try and get across some of the information, there's a lot of scenes, and he uses the exact same trick that he did with Adira. He uses flashbacks so that characters see events from Babylon Squared, and it's like, aha, this is what was relevant then, and this is what was relevant then. Again, I'm not a huge fan of the flashback method. It feels a little cheap to me, but I do also have to admit that the opposite relies on the audience remembering stuff that happened in real terms a couple of years ago. So, I guess it's time to go ahead and talk about the time travel. Let me just go ahead and say that with one very important exception. The time travel in Babylon 5 is self-consistent. That makes sense because it's also ridiculously simple. I know that sounds weird, but it is. It's funny, actually. And I don't have an answer for this. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on this. But a fairly large chunk of the episode, several minutes, is spent explaining what is ultimately a very simple time loop. And I mean, I could draw it with 3 dots and a couple of arrows. It's here, okay, then here, then here. That's it. I mean, there's a couple of variances for individual characters, notably Sheridan, but that is the time loop. Boom. That's it. I don't know why that is. I don't know why so much time and effort was spent on it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's talk about the exception. I have gone on record many times as saying that I hate possible futures. I hate alternate futures. I hate it because, from a literary perspective, it feels like cheating. And I talked about this before with regards to the whole prophecy of Babylon 5's destruction thing, which is actually mentioned in a flashback in this episode. Because to me, it's like... It feels like it builds cheap drama to be like, oh my god, I have seen the future, and in the future we're all dead! Oh, but it's okay, we averted it. Whew! Why'd you even bother at that point? I don't like that. Now, that is just my opinion and my preference, but I prefer it when we do what I refer to as the time as a singular line theory. In other words, all that ever has happened is all that ever will happen. Now, with the one exception, that is exactly what we have here. Everything happens in this episode, with the exception of the nitpicks I mentioned earlier. Everything happens as it did happen and will happen, and then the loop is complete. Boom, we're done. So why have this alternate timeline thing? We had it with with Sinclair's vision back in Babylon Squared, and we have it with the vision of Ivanova fighting off the shadows who are wiping her out. That's the one thing that doesn't fit. For some reason, they're getting these time-displaced messages from another future which will never and has never happened. Because it never did happen, because they always went back to... And we know this for 100% certainty, because the Minbari exist. Because the Minbari are the Minbari as the way they are. They talk about Valen and all those things. You know, there's 100,000 signs that this always happened and will always happen. So why this sudden alternate future thing? It drives me crazy, and it's forgive me for ranting on this point, but it's the only flaw in what I otherwise consider to be a fantastic episode. I really enjoyed this, except for the beginning where it's like Ivanova scenes. Don't get me wrong, the scene was powerful. Seeing Ivanova, you know, the frickin' pillar of solidarity in terror and nightmarish horror as she dies, was a very powerful scene. Maybe that's why it was included. I don't know. But it still made me go, what? Why? I also want to say really quick, by the way, just in the back of your mind, think about the idea of how what would have to happen in a galaxy for Ivanova to be that terrified. Just picture a galaxy overrun with the shadows. Just think about it for a bit. Don't worry, we've got something even more horrifying later on to talk about. So yeah, let's talk about the time travel really quick here. B4, so we've basically got 3 time periods. Technically 4. We'll go and cover all 4. Okay, the past, the War with the Shadows, the recent past, that's when B4 was made, the somewhat more recent past, which is also the past, that's Babylon Squared, and then the present, which is when we go into there, and then to there, and then to there, leading back to the present. Also, I suppose we could also include the future, where Sheridan is. I'll talk about that separate. That's kind of a separate topic. So, in Babylon... Okay, so B4 is pulled forward to the time of Babylon Squared, taking with it the people from this episode. B4 then jumps back, even further back. Everyone goes on. Everything's fine. We fast forward a few years. War Without End happens. We jump into the time thing, which sends us back to before B4 does its first jump. We are carried forward with B4 doing its first jump. I keep wanting to say Sheridan. Sinclair and Zathras go back to the original, and the rest of us go back to the present. Boom. Very complete. There's no loose threads, no loose ends there. And yet a lot of time is spent on that. A lot of time is spent explaining that fairly simple loop. I think the best reason I could say why, and I wrote a note here about that, is that it's all about the writing trick. Time travel is one of those pot of gold at the end of rainbow kind of situations when it comes to writing, because it's hard to write good time travel. I have talked about this before. It is my opinion that the majority, not all, of good stories that include time travel are good because they were good stories that include time travel, rather than being time travel stories. So everyone wants to pull off that trick as a writer. Everyone wants to pull off the great time travel trick when it comes to writing. And, I mean, it's not like it's that hard to be self-consistent with time travel, but the problem is there are still flaws, even in a self-consistent time travel story. Getting the audience on your side, getting the audience to believe you is basically the trick. You pull that off, it's the big trick. Oh my god, they did this and it all fits and it all makes sense! And that's what they're going for. That's the closest thing that I have to a theory as to why so much of this episode was devoted into explaining the time jumps. If you have any other information or theories, please feel free to share. I do know that JMS didn't actually write War Without End, Part 1 and 2, when he wrote Babylon Squared. But he did write down the outline, as he would need to, in order to be able to write War Without End and make, write both halves of the conversation. I have a note here. I don't actually have a lot to say about the Sinclair stuff. He has a bunch of screen time. It's good stuff. You can kind of tell he was having issues even doing these relatively short scenes. Watch his eyes. It's very apparent in hindsight. But he did some good stuff. It was good hearing him again. It was good seeing him again. I don't have much to share about that. It's a good thing that the Shadows sent fighters to take out B4 rather than cruisers. I mean, think about that for a moment. The White Star is capable of taking out fighters, has a little bit more of a difficulty taking out cruisers. In fact, has only done so twice, and both times it was in very, very unusual circumstances. So, good thing for us. It is also funny to me, though. I mentioned how things do line up, both ends of the conversation. They actually mentioned the EMP thing and how it's significant to the plot of Babylon Squared. It's funny in hindsight that we actually caused that by taking out the fusion bomb, which was supposed to destroy the station in War Without End. And it wasn't planned, but that EMP is what allows them to board Babylon 4 undetected. Funny how that lines up, isn't it? It's just more evidence to the whole, not only the both sides of the conversation perspective, but the fact that, in character, all of this always did happen and always will happen. Complete loop. Time is a linear line situation. I like Sinclair taking charge. I have another note here. Poor Zathras. Nobody listens to Zathras. There are so many instances in this episode where nobody actually does listen to Zathras. He says something and they're like, nope. Or they dismiss it, or they presume he's lying, or they just completely ignore him. There's actually a line specifically where they flat out call him, oh, Zathras is mad. Yeah, I'll get to that. So Marcus's line is great. We're into part 2, by the way. Like I said, I didn't have much to say about part 1. I do want to say this really quick. Part 2 has a 3-minute teaser. I think that's a new record for B5. I actually thought they just weren't going to do a teaser at all. Now, that does include the rehash of the first episode, but still, it's huge. Anyways, so Marcus has this great line. Ivanova's like, what do we do? Oh, God. And then Marcus comes down and is like, that would have been the worst possible time to be discovered, so I decided to hide in case we were. That is an amazingly cynical perspective, and again showcases why he's Marcus and why he's awesome. And why Marcus is better than Batman. No, he is kind of a Batman-y character. There's really no denying that. But I mean that in a positive way, not a negative one. Yes, so I suppose now would be a good time to talk about the future. I was going to posit a question, and I'm still going to, but in my mind there's no doubt anymore. Do you think that the future that Sheridan perceives, the one on Centauri Prime, is the future? Remember, time's a linear line, right? So, alternate future, possible future, what do you think? See, the thing is, I mention that because we have seen where people will see possible futures, like Sinclair did, like they saw with the Ivanova thing, but all of that is visions. However, when someone actually travels around, thanks to their thing being incoherent, they actually end up there, and therefore seem to be interacting with what appears to be, shall we say, the prime timeline. So, in addition to that, all the pieces of the future on Centauri Prime rather neatly fit up with everything we know, even including spoilers that I'm not actually going to be discussing here. I thought about it, but I've decided not to bring them up. There's only a few things to really mention. So, fun fact, people had been asking JMS. JMS was very big about interacting with his audience back when Babylon 5 was coming out, which was awesome, by the way. This is back when news groups and Usenet and whatnot was actually really starting to gain some serious stride. And so it was possible for them to interact back and forth like that. So, JMS had been asked many, many times, when are Sheridan and Delenn going to kiss? When are they going to finally kiss? I find that hilarious. I'm not sure I would be particularly invested in that particular fact, but a lot of people apparently were, since they're all like, come on, let them kiss already. So I like the fact that JMS keeps saying, no, it's not time yet, it's not time yet. Now, he didn't rush it. I like how their first kiss happens with a future version of her who's already in love with him, and has been in love with him, and has already had a child with him. And there's one other factoid. I'm not going to spoil, but think, for those of you who've seen this series, just picture for a moment what it was like from Delenn's perspective in the future to suddenly see Sheridan there. Just picture that. Picture what that would mean to her. So, yeah, that was a nice scene. For the first time, there's some real genuine chemistry between the two, which I liked. Delenn also, the actress does a good job of basically acting differently around Sheridan. She does it, and it's funny because it's the same actress doing the other scenes on the rest of the show at the same time, but she completely shifts her body language when she's around Sheridan in the future, and that's logical. I mean, by that point they've been together long enough to have a child, so that makes sense. But I like that, again, that additional amount of acting to help further flesh out the character. It's a nice touch. So the future, right? I'm not sure where to start. Let's start with the Keepers. We don't know all the details about the Keepers, nor will we for some time. All I'm going to say is that the Keepers are goddamn terrifying. They're horrible. They are horrible. They are the most horrible thing in Babylon 5, in my opinion, and they challenge most other fictional settings for horrible things. Wow. We all have our Keepers. Yeah. One thing I want to comment on, though, in addition to that, it's so obvious in hindsight why Londo is acting the way he does when he's like, rah, 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 this is all your fault. If you pay attention, he's doing exposition, which I find hilarious, because it's for our sake, of course, the viewers. And yet, if you think about it, it is also, in a way, Londo himself giving information to Sheridan that he might then use, as he does later when the Keeper is asleep. Also, drinking himself into a stupor in order to get some moments of free time from the Keeper is not only absolutely nightmarishly horrifying, but very Londo. Which brings me to an interesting point. It was kind of brutal, very brutal, actually, seeing Londo so broken. I talked about this just in the previous episode, how Londo had found a new low. This is a different kind of low, but definitely a very new low for Londo. A very broken, embittered, defeated old man who has lost. And yet, this is one of the things I really do like about Londo's character. And yet, despite all that, despite being a broken, embittered shell who is quite literally a prisoner in his own body and is enslaved by a race of aliens we'll get into much, much later, who are wiping out his people and ravaging his lands, despite everything, he hasn't actually given up. He hasn't actually yielded. He sends off Sheridan and Delenn, well, just Delenn, really, to be the final hope for his people. He sends them off to make things work in the future for his people, for their existence. Now, we don't know the exact timing, so forgive me if I'm about to give incorrect information. This is kind of spoilery. But based on a certain made-for-TV movie that came out after B5 finished, which I think happened before the events of Londo's final night, after, I'm saying that wrong, after the events of Londo's final night, it gives me hope to think that in his final moment of defiance, the one last thing he wanted to do for his people actually succeeded, given what Sheridan ends up doing with the boy in that particular made-for-TV movie. I have hope that that's what happened, because not only do I like Londo as a character, but I think that kind of incredible level of defiance should be rewarded with success. Which brings me to another brilliant scene. Londo and G'Kar. Come in, my old friend. And God, it's funny because it's written in a way to belie things. But I'm just going to go out and say it. It's pretty clear that there's a real friendship there. Now, I've speculated before that Londo and G'Kar could have been fast friends, and we had that glimpse of that all the way back when the Shadows first entered the picture, really. Here we see the two, at the very least, having a perspective of mutual respect, and Londo basically begging G'Kar to kill him in order to ensure that his final act of defiance succeeds. And unfortunately, doing so wakes up the Keeper, which then causes him to strangle G'Kar back. And yet in a very Narn fashion, very Jakar, he doesn't let go. And he does actually end up succeeding in killing Londo, thereby ensuring that his act succeeded. Wow. Just wow. And then, of course, Veer walks in and picks up the Emperor's necklace thing. I forget what it's called, but it's the thing that indicates you are the Emperor. I guess that prophecy did turn out to be true. Assuming, of course, this is the actual future, which obviously I am presuming it is, because, again, it lines up very neatly with the Prime timeline. So after all that fun stuff, with Emperor Londo, we zip back. And, of course, no one listens to Zathras. And so there's a power surge, and they get jumped forward. Now, the really funny thing is that was a huge oops that nearly caused everything to go terrible, and yet if it hadn't, would have guaranteed that things would have gone even worse. It's okay, though. It always happened, so it always will happen. You get it. That's what causes the jump to the era of Babylon Squared. For a very large amount of the rest of the episode, there's huge chunks of the episode that are literally Babylon Squared copied in, like I mentioned. I don't begrudge them that. I understand why they did that. I've already given my thoughts on that. But it means I don't have a lot to say for the rest of this episode. I've got like 4 more lines of notes here. And it does line up very nicely, aside from those few nitpicks and glitches I mentioned, some of which can be explained away, which isn't really a particularly huge issue. But what I find very funny is that after all this time, the one person who finally listens to Zathras is Sinclair. And because he does, he completes the time loop. He listens to Zathras, goes back, leaves the station, and as a result is available to do all the things which lead to him becoming Valen, which leads to the Minbari people, which leads to... He also tries to send a message to Garibaldi right at the end there. Now, I think that was a very important scene. You see him, he's just floating in space, and he's just trying to... You can see him wrestling with something, and finally he sends the message, Garibaldi, watch your back, watch your back. Doesn't get across. He doesn't get the message across. You can't change time, after all, remember? That's the whole point of the time as a linear line theory. You can't change it. It always happened and always will happen the way it always happened and always will happen. But what I like about that scene is that it's very human. Because we needed to see the person, the man, if you will, the down-to-earth individual who was flawed and emotional and in a moment of weakness reached out to his friend to try and help him. Even knowing the consequences, even knowing it would completely jeopardize his mission in so many ways, he just had to try and reach out to help his friend. That was very important, I think, to help establish him before he became the legend. It is my opinion that the best written legends are the ones who were people first. I don't mean just before they became a legend. I mean, when it comes to writing their characteristics, you write the person, and then you write the legend. And with that, and a few other things, we see that Sinclair is a person before he is Valen. And so he becomes Valen. I love how Marcus is the one who figures it out, by the way. Of course he does. He puts 2 and 2 together very quickly and very efficiently. I also like how he immediately volunteers for it, and ironically, would be the right choice under some circumstances. But because of the whole nature of the time travel, you go back to your time period, you have to pay for the years thing, Sinclair going back would have been useless anyways. He would have just died of old age. So there would be no benefit to losing both of them, even if we ignore the fact that Sinclair had to go back, become Valen, and cause the entirety of the future to happen. Or the present, or the past, or however you want to think of that. But I do like that. It is very Marcus to immediately say, no, I volunteer. My life will finally have some frickin' meaning. Remember, that's been the majority character development and arc for him for most of his presentation so far. What's funny, though, is that's also kind of Sinclair's arc, isn't it? Sinclair agrees to go back, and I forget the exact wording, but he says something along the lines of, "At last, my life has a purpose." And I mention that because I didn't talk about it much, because honestly, we never got there. But Sinclair's intended arc was always, what is the point of me? I mean, obviously he had some serious survivor guilt, being one of the survivors of the line, but that always his character development always took a backstory to his relevance to the plot in season one, and then issues happened, as we've discussed, and we never really continued that character arc. But the character arc does reach a satisfying conclusion, in my opinion, within this episode, because that character arc was always, what's the point of me? What is my place in life? What am I here to do? Am I here to be a pilot? Am I here to be a captain? Am I here to be a general or an army? Well, as it turns out, he is here to do something. And again, I like that that fits if you believe in concepts such as fate, or if you just think that people like to have things that fit them, or that they fit within reality. You know, the Tetris block situation. I like that a lot. And I like, they spend a large amount of time on the big reveal that he is Valen. And with good, I talked about that right at the beginning. There's good reason for that. JMS has been building up to this point for 3 to 10 years, depending on how you define it. I would want to spend some time on the reveal too. And again, he uses the flashback trick that I've mentioned in the previous 2 episodes now, well, previous episode plus this one, in order to really emphasize all the things that you might have missed. I find myself wondering what happened with him. I know some of the side works do examine some of what happened with Valen back then. At the time, JMS went on record saying that he deliberately left things vague, so that people could kind of write in their own messages, their own stories about what happened. Makes me curious, though. Either way, that's all I've got for War Without End. And I do hope that I'll see you guys next time.